Okay, well, now we have spent the first hour, we talked about primarily the distinction between, or the very muddy, that word just came up, distinction between Jew and Gentile Christian, or the Jewish people and the church in the first century. We talked about how really it's hard to differentiate between the two. The church was in many ways part of the Jewish people, even though it was increasingly Gentile. But now what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is look at some of the authors of this 3-century long period before Nicaea, or what we would call actually the Constantinian era. So we've seen these distinctions occurring. We talked a little bit about the word Christian. The word Christian only occurs 3 times in the New Testament. It's a word that, however, is quickly taken up and turns up in other literature. And in the New Testament, it's not necessarily a term that has great merit to itself. In the third time the term Christian is used, it is actually used in such a way that we can tell that it probably had some shameful connotations, some pejorative, like insult-related connotations, and had to be reclaimed by the early believers. So far from just taking the insult and cowering, they took it and owned it and accepted it. That it was in Antioch where the New Testament tells us the word Christian or Christianos was first used is quite significant, especially as there are a number of key early Christian documents that come from Antioch, and also a number of key Christian leaders that come from Antioch in the first centuries. We've already touched upon the Didache, and there's a lot of discussion as to was the Didache composed in Egypt or was it composed somewhere else, but most people have come to the conclusion that Antioch is the most likely place. Now, Antioch is buried under a sea of mud today, and what was standing in Antioch just a few weeks ago is largely damaged because of the terrible earthquake that's occurred there. But Antioch was a regional power at the time. It was a significant city in the Roman Empire, and it was also a significant city in terms of the history of the Jewish people, as governor of Syria was at one point stationed there, as well as his army. The Didache, as I date it, was written sometime around the year 70 or shortly after. I'm pretty sure it would have been complete by the year 80, and not edited significantly, at least, any time after that. But shortly after the Didache, we have some letters written by a bishop of Antioch. And that bishop is Ignatius, or if you want to be picky, Ignatius. And these letters were written, however, not in Antioch, but while he was on his way to Rome to be, as he puts it, torn apart by wild beasts. Something that he was really looking forward to, so that he might participate in the suffering of his Savior. He seems to have been on a roll during his trip to Rome, quite excited about the prospect. There is no negativity in his letters. He seems excited about what's going to happen. This is kind of going to be the climax as well as the end of his life. But in his writing, as he gives his final instructions to churches that he has a relationship with or knows about, he gives them instructions that he hopes will guide them into the future. The year is probably around 110, And in his writings, we can already see a growing distinction between the early church and the Jewish people. In his mind, there is now more of a division than there was before. So he is not ashamed to use the word Christian. Discrimination or singling out of the church as Christians is just one angle by which the church and the Jewish people were being separated as at this time. The church obviously was becoming increasingly populated by Gentiles, and in Ignatius's day and before his day, in the time between the Didache and his letters to the various churches, the Gentiles were beginning to find themselves in a rather precarious position. And this wasn't just because there were viewpoints floating around, such as that of the Didache, which put them under the Torah in a sense, but under different limited obligations than the Jewish people. It wasn't just because there was some form of class distinction going on in the early church, but even more so, there was a growing sense of anti-Semitism, if you want to take a more modern term and apply it to that day, growing in the Roman Empire, and certainly within Antioch itself. That was a really hospitable city for the Jewish people. It was a city where they had a very long history, established in 300 BCE, and yet one that was now beginning to experience periodic pogroms against the Jewish people. The Jewish people in Antioch and elsewhere were an established ethnic group with special civil rights and special privileges in the Roman Empire in that day. In a sense, they were a nation within a nation. The Roman Empire was not quite a nation or an empire in the way that we think of nations and empires today, as the idea of a nation state being a multi-ethnic nation in which all people are equal. Something that has arisen in the last couple hundred years was not really the conception of people in the Greco-Roman day. And so the Jews were a nation within a nation. Christianity, by contrast, was a newcomer on the scene and had no obvious claims to being a legitimate religion. It was, by all appearances, to outsiders, what would appear to the Romans, what we would call today, a cult. It was a marginal group. The situation of Gentile Christians was further difficult because while the Jewish believers, they could go as Jews and their category was clear, their situation became more difficult also because of the Fiscus Judaicus, the Jewish tax. Now, this was a tax on all Jewish people, which until the temple was destroyed was applied to them so that they might fund the operation of the temple in Jerusalem. After the destruction of the temple, that Fiscus Judaicus began to be used for other things objectionable to the Jewish people, pagan worship in the city of Jerusalem. As a tax on the Jews, it was applicable to all Jews. No doubt Messianic Jews, if we want to, again, use a modern term, apply it to an ancient situation. After the First Jewish War, Vespasian, who had begun the siege on Jerusalem, was now emperor. And he was enforcing this tax upon the Jewish people so that they might take this money, and as an insult of sorts, this money would be diverted to the temple of Jupiter in Rome. The tax was for 2 drachmas, which was more or less 2 days' wages. So for most people, it was neither a huge amount nor an insignificant amount of money. It was something, though, that was a slap in the face for the Jewish people, many of whom had opposed the war against Rome in the first place. Not all Jews were for that war. What made it worse was Vespasian's son Domitian. Domitian reigned from 81 to 96 CE when he became emperor. Domitian was an authoritarian. He administered the tax harshly. Courts would publicly inspect men's genitals to see if they were circumcised and if they were or were not Jews who were avoiding paying the tax. If they were trying to avoid the tax, they could lose all of their property. I'm tempted to make a joke there, but I'll avoid it. In terms of the relationship between the church and the Jewish people, it was ruled that if someone who was not Jewish was living a Jewish lifestyle, they not only had to pay the tax, but were also forced to offer sacrifice to the Roman gods and to the Roman emperor. This was going to be a double whammy for the Jewish believer, for the Gentile believer. They were being classed as Jews in terms of the tax, but they were being forced to worship the emperor as Romans and Greeks and pagans. Obviously, this put certain members of the church in not just a financial, but also a theological bind. Worship of the emperor was completely forbidden, not only to Jews, but also to Gentile Christians. And so, since not only Christian Jews, but any Christian Gentiles who were in close contact with them were subject to these laws, there was a motive for the Gentile to distance himself or herself from both Jewish believers and Jewish practices. The Emperor Nerva, he was from 96 to 98, who would succeed Domitian after he was assassinated, rolled back Domitian's harsh rules, even coining some coins that indicated that, saying that the offense was being rolled back. But the damage in terms of the social division in the church was already done. This would be another factor in the division of the church between the church and the Jewish people. Because as we discussed last hour, generally the church was considered part of, at least in some way, part of the Jewish people. By the time of the Second Jewish War, or we could say the third in some respects because there was an intervening one as well, in 132 to 135 CE, it was the Fiscus Judaicus, this tax, was an institution that still had a long life ahead of it. And so naturally this had a significant contributing effect. It provided impetus to the church's trajectory away from its Jewish origins and the Jewish people. Christians had ample motivation to set aside any Jewish practices and association with the Jews to avoid Domitian's persecution and any social discrimination as well that might involve. In fact, various scholars argue that they would take steps to show the Romans that they were indeed distinct from the Jewish people. A Christian identity was being formed in which Jews could have no part, because a Jewish Christian could not claim to be a Gentile Christian and get away with it. If they took part in this new Christian identity that was in a sense a legal cover for the Gentile Christian, they would endanger it. Also, Messianic Jews could also lose their status in the eyes of the Roman Empire, no longer being classified as Jews, but in some cases as unlicensed atheists. So this is the context that Ignatius comes into. On the Jewish side, there was a divergence between the church and the Jewish people that was developing, although along different lines. And I think we're all familiar with the issue of the minim, the Birkat HaMinim. Here, the Jewish believer, according to some, was estranged from the world of the Tanaim and their society. The traditional view, and I'm going to argue a little bit about this, Travers Herford quotes the Tosefta on Shabbat 13. The margins and books of the Minim, they do not save, but these are burnt in their place. They and their memorials, that is the sacred name that would be in the texts of the Jewish believers, are to be burned. Rabbi Yosei the Galilean says, on a weekday, one cuts out the memorials and hides them and burns the rest. Rabbi Tarfon said, may I lose my son. Can't think of a more horrific statement than that. If they come into my hand, I would burn them and their memorials too. If the pursuer were pursuing after me, I would enter into a house of idolatry, and I enter not into their houses. For the idolaters do not acknowledge God and speak falsely concerning him. But these, the Messianic Jews, do acknowledge him and speak falsely concerning him. Rabbi Ishmael said, whereas God says, let my name which is written in holiness be blotted out in water, how much more the books of the Minim, which put enmity and jealousy and strife between Israel and their Father who is in heaven, should be blotted out, and their memorials, the name of God, as they wrote it, too. So in this passage, we have a rather sad record of the Tanaim, the most prominent in the text being Rabbi Tarfon. Tarfon, who survived the destruction of the temple, continued after it to be a distinct follower of its practices, continuing to eat the tithe. But he was also a noted opponent elsewhere as well of the Jewish believers. And so the context is a discussion what to do with the texts of these early believers. We can presume these might have been the Gospels, possibly Hebrew fragments from the Gospels. There are remnants that are spoken about in the Church Fathers in Hebrew, and possibly Aramaic, because people didn't distinguish in that day so much between Hebrew and Aramaic. The rather shocking position of Rabbi Yosei and ultimately Rabbi Ishmael is that these texts, complete with the divine name within them, should be destroyed one way or another, even burned. And it should be noted this is completely opposite from Jewish custom, where we never burn the name of the Lord. You don't throw sacred texts in the fire. You bury them, and bury them in a way that gives them the greatest of respect, as if they were human themselves. In the midst of that harsh discussion, now remember, this is written after the time period we are talking about, but is supposedly recording rabbis of this early day, the days of the Didache leading up to the days of Ignatius. In the midst of this already harsh discussion, Rabbi Tarfon states that he would not only burn them, but would not enter the house of a Jewish believer even if his life depended on it, using that horrific curse, even if my son's life depended on it. He views the Jewish believer as worse than a pagan or idolater, especially because as Jews, they should know better. And I think we can see that attitude continuing even today to some degree, as Jews are who are believers in Yeshua are considered in some ways worse than Christians. This estrangement between Jew and Jew may not have been one-sided either, for the Didache, as we saw before, shows a marked desire to separate its Gentile recipients from Jews who might have an influence on them. Thus, Didache 8 instructs, "Your fasts shall not be kept with the hypocrites, for they fast on the second day," that's Monday, Yom Sheni, "and the 5th, Thursday. You must fast on the 4th, Wednesday, and preparation, Friday. Neither shall you pray like the hypocrites, but as the Lord called you to in his gospel." The Didache is clearly trying to make sure that the believers they are writing to will not end up praying with Jewish traditionalists on their days of fasting, but that they will fast on a separate day. They are attempting to force a social division. And so it seems to be a significant concern to the Didache, and we had a question regarding this in the first hour, which warns its disciples against being hypocrites, telling them to hate all hypocrisy in Didache 4, and reminding them that hypocrisy is one of the things that characterizes the way of death in Didache 5. And so the Jewish rejection of Jewish believers has already been met by reciprocal rejection of religious Jews by the Jewish believers, also involving those who are not Jewish, trying to keep the Gentiles away from the influence of the religious. This, the social effect of the Fiscus Judaicus and more, these difficulties had a roll-on effect in part because of the concurrent development in the church of supersessionism. This supersessionism, as we will see, may in part have been in reaction to the diminished Jerusalem and Jewish Jesus movement, but also from other factors, an appropriation of Israel's eschatological prospects and the conviction that God was now judging the Jewish people for rejecting their Messiah. Back to Ignatius. He is one of the earliest church writers to demonstrate these trends in church thinking. His writings, perhaps also in light of the Didache's somewhat Torah affirmative stance, show the dual Christian redefinition of what Torah is, what it means for the believer, and its redefinition of what the hope of Israel is, appropriating it in some ways. He frequently, as we suggested, uses the word Christian, attesting to its now honorable connotations, at least in his circle. In his letter to the Ephesians, he attests to Jesus being of the race, and he uses the Greek word genos, of the people of David, qualified, of course, by saying, according to the flesh. To the Magnesians, he seeks to distance them from Judaism, saying, "For if we have lived according to Judaism until now, we admit that we have not received God's gracious gift." Already at this early date, then, there is a rejection of Judaism. There's a rejection also of the Sabbath in favor of the Lord's Day. And then, categorically, Ignatius proceeds to assert that it is outlandish to proclaim Jesus Christ and practice Judaism, for Christianity did not believe in Judaism, but Judaism in Christianity. And we'll clarify that rather strange phrase in a few minutes. Christianity in which every tongue that believes in God has been gathered together. In somewhat the same vein, using a similar form of expression, Ignatius tells the Philadelphians, If anyone should interpret Judaism to you, do not hear him. For it is better to hear Christianity from a man who is circumcised than Judaism from one who is uncircumcised. Whatever Ignatius means to say by these statements while on his way to martyrdom, it's clear that he is seeking to distance the churches of the Magnesians and Philadelphians from Judaism. The question we may want to ask is, what Judaism is he talking about? Is he talking about Gentiles who are attending synagogues? Or is he talking about Gentiles who are associating with Jewish believers in Yeshua, or with other Gentiles who have accepted a more Jewish form of Christianity? Matt Johnson McCabe highlights this development in his new significant work, Jewish Christianity, the Making of the Christianity-Judaism Divide. Then as now, it's anachronistic, he says, to speak of any such thing as Judaism, as its definition depended on whom you were talking about. Further, one may want to think about the obvious implication of Ignatius' letter. There were those in the Magnesian church who did practice Judaism, or else this wouldn't have been written. Ignatius is part of the process of the church working to create a divide. This is a process that would continue, identity formation, beyond the 3 centuries we are looking at today, for even Chrysostom. And Chrysostom lived in the latter part of the 4th century, died in the early 5th. Chrysostom, and from Antioch himself, struggled to enforce this divide while Archbishop of Constantinople. Remember, he was in the middle of a series of sermons against the Arians, and he had to interrupt himself because the Jewish holidays were coming along, and he wrote a number of harsh sermons against Judaism and Jewish practices. But what kind of Judaism was Ignatius writing about? Something recognizably Jewish, something he viewed as destructive to the gospel, and possibly for good reason, and something that members of his recipient churches had no apparent problem with. Again, he wouldn't have been writing about this, it wouldn't have been on his mind if there was not an issue. Gentiles were hanging out with Jews one way or another, or at least adopting Jewish practices. We can go beyond Ignatius, and chronologically we could get from him shortly after to Clement. And it's important to remember that while various writings have been attributed to Clement, most famously the Clementine homilies and the related Clementine recognition, these works are actually pseudonymous. They were not written by him. While they themselves are quite late, perhaps around 400 CE, these recognitions and homilies do contain information that is of interest to those who want to find out about Christian Judaism. They record an ancient strata of information, ancient literature. This is primarily contained in some fascinating sermons by Peter, the Kerygmata Petru, as they are generally termed, and they seem to contain material from the late 2nd century. At this point, I'd like to look at 2nd Clement, though, just for a moment, and that is dated in 140 CE. In it, we find some similarities to the Didache. Here, Clement, or someone using his name, speaks of the God who created you. That's the wording of the Didache. It's quite different in the Greek from the Didache's God who made you, but nevertheless, there is a similarity. Further, it is worth noting that actually I misspoke. He did not say God who created you, he said God who created us. The Didache says the God who made you. That's because it's a Jew writing to Gentiles. This is Clement, who presumably is at this point a writer after Clement, who is saying God who created us. He has absorbed what the Didache has taught. He identifies himself with the Gentiles. As does the Didache, he cites the Sermon on the Mount, enjoining his readers to love their enemies and those who hate you, following Luke chapter 6, verse 27, over that's the way that statement is written in Matthew 5 and verse 44. Second Clement speaks much about the need for repentance from the whole heart, something we would agree with. From a sincere heart, he says, somewhere else. And then elsewhere, later on, with a pure heart. And later on, from deep within. This lays the groundwork for Clement to speak on the relationship between Christ and the church. And this is where he makes a seminal statement that the church has not come into being just now, but has existed from the beginning. For it existed spiritually, as did our Jesus. And even though the church was spiritual, it became manifest in Christ's flesh. We'd be wise not to pass this statement by, because it represents a shift in Christian attitudes towards their own identity during this period, however aware or not they might have been to the Jewish roots of their faith. Here is a conception of the church as having always been, and having always been something that transcended and was detached from the Jewish people. In other words, they're viewing Christianity as something that began long before the church began on the day of Pentecost. That is not their view. And of course, it's the view of many today who might ask questions like, was Abraham a Christian? That same kind of mentality, that there is something that goes over and above both, that overarches. But Clement identifies that with the church, that is now the Gentile people, and is, while somewhat inclusive of the Jewish people, also something distinct. So this is probably what is behind Ignatius's statement to the Magnesians a minute ago that we mentioned, that Christianity did not believe in Judaism, but Judaism in Christianity. In other words, Ignatius is saying Judaism had some of the truth of Christianity, but not all of it. To press the point further, this is a distancing of the teaching of the church from the teaching of the synagogue. Even in a book that seems somewhat similar in some respects, as I showed, to a book like the Didache, there is the beginning of a supersessionist conception that says, actually, our roots are not in the works of God with the nation of Israel, but in a reality that overarches the nation of Israel. It's problematic. There's some partial truth in there, but it's also a distortion. So now we can return to these kerygmata Petru. These are the preachings of Peter in the homilies and the recognitions of Clement. They are part of what is presumed to be a Grundschrift, a basic foundational document underlying much of the homilies and recognitions. And there's strong evidence that this kerygmata Petru actually is material rooted in the late 2nd century. It shows that there was there, and in the day when this was written into the recognitions and homilies, a form of Christianity that we see elsewhere, one strong enough to have survived and perhaps later be the whipping boy of John Chrysostom in the late 4th century, a form of Christianity that was Jewish in many ways, whether or not all of its members were Jewish. People who studied the recognitions of these pseudo-Clementines are more and more aware that and agreed that the audience is predominantly Gentile, and that this document is casting Peter as the opponent to Pauline Christianity. We might wonder why such a document could be written around the year 400. Clearly, Jewish Christianity, whatever it was continuing in that day, continuing to be a thing. Recently, there's actually been a lot of shade cast on the Clementines by significant scholars like Graham Stanton and James Carlton Paget, both from Cambridge. And they're probably right. It is difficult to have any meaningful form of textual criticism, to know what is what when you're dealing with a text where you're not sure what the Grundschrift is, this hypothetical document that underlies part of these recognitions is, and you're not sure whether or not and how much of that is the preaching of Peter. It's difficult to know what is going on. Still, what the Clementines demonstrate is undoubtedly a strand of Christianity. Sorry, my computer's playing tricks on me again, going to sleep. We'll get there. Still, they demonstrate a strand of Christianity persisting well after our period of 3 centuries that has a strong relationship to a Jewish form of Christianity. The Clementines hold to the ongoing validity of the law. They speak about the ongoing value of Jewish customs. They're generally silent in terms of any form of supersessionism or triumphalism. At the same time, they are clear in their exaltation of Yeshua, but as we've seen, they have grave problems with Paul, and in addition, they have grave problems with his authenticity as a person and his vision on the road to Damascus, as after all, anyone can have a vision. And so they contest the form of gospel that he preached to the Gentiles. Perhaps their very existence betrays an underlying tension that's evident in evangelicalism and in the Messianic movement as well today, where there are those who struggle to reconcile the identity of the Jewish people with their own identity as Gentile believers and struggle to figure out what their obligations are and what their relationship to Israel is. That aside, we can go on from Clement now to Barnabas. Barnabas was probably written in Alexandria. Some of the themes of both Ignatius and Clement are reflected more generally by Barnabas, which probably has been written about 10 years after Ignatius's martyrdom. Barnabas reflects Ignatius's negative approach to the Jewish people even further and gives the impression of a rapid hardening of attitudes. Barnabas is interesting in part because he reproduces a good part of the first half of the Didache in its later chapters and basically concludes with that section in Barnabas 18 to 21. Far more than the Didache or even Ignatius, Barnabas references the Hebrew Bible. He speaks not only in general terms of the prophets and Moses, but also of Daniel. He cites Adam, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. then he speaks of Abraham at length again by himself, Isaac at length again, Jacob again at length by himself. Joshua he speaks of, Amalek, David, Isaiah, Isaac and Rebekah, Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. He brings up Enoch and even brings up traditions such as are seen in 4Q Ezekiel, the Dead Sea Scrolls. In addition, the book is full of references to places, stories, quotations, allusions, and even some seemingly midrashic Jewish traditions which aren't attested to anywhere else. We could call them a kind of Tosafot, such as Moses stacking shields to stand on in the war against Amalek. One would think that Barnabas, being so in tune, more than Ignatius or the Didache, to the Hebrew Bible origins of faith, would have a greater appreciation of the relationship or even continuity between the church and the Jewish people. But actually, that means nothing. Proves the opposite. Citing Isaiah 1, verses 11 to 13, which is fair enough to quote it, Barnabas nevertheless uses it to strike out with a strident tone, citing also from the prophets and from Psalms. This is what he says. "What is the multitude of your sacrifices to me?" quoting Isaiah, says the Lord. "I am sated with whole burnt offerings and have no desire for the fat of lambs, the blood of bulls and goats. Not even if you should come to appear before me. For who sought these things from your hand? Trample my court no longer. If you bring fine flour, it is futile. Incense is loathsome to me. I cannot stand your new moons and Sabbaths." And so he nullified these things, that the new law of our Lord Jesus Christ, which is without the yoke of compulsion, should provide an offering not made by humans. And again he says to them, "Did I command your fathers who came out from the land of Egypt to offer whole burnt offerings and sacrifices to me? No, this is what I commanded them. Let none of you bear a grudge against your neighbor in your heart, and do not love a false oath." So there he's using the Hebrew Bible to testify against itself, to say that the whole system of offerings was false. Barnabas proceeds later in a discussion of Moses to claim Moses understood that the law was broken and cast the 2 tablets from his hands, something the Hebrew Bible never says. And their covenant was smashed, that the covenant of his beloved Jesus might be sealed in our hearts in the hope brought by faith in him. His interpretation of prophetic texts divorces them from Israel. Thus, for some of the things written about him concerning Israel, others concern us. And so it says, "He was wounded because of our lawless acts and weakened because of our sins." Further, Barnabas says, "Therefore the Son of God came in the flesh for this reason, that he might total up all the sins of those who persecuted his prophets to death." Decidedly anti-Jewish stance. Throughout the epistle, Barnabas spiritualizes, and this is one of the notable characteristics of him, he spiritualizes both the Torah and the sacrificial system, reinterpreting everything he addresses to apply to the church. This leads him to write, "Now let us see whether it is the church or the first one that receives the inheritance, and whether the covenant is for us, the church, or them, the Jews." Barnabas proceeds to reference the events in the founding of Israel where the younger child was preferred over the elder, as was the case with Jacob and Esau, and also with Ephraim and Manasseh. His conclusion? "See, Abraham, I have made you a father of the nations who believe in God while uncircumcised." That's Barnabas. I think we have time for one more, and that will be Melito at this point. Melito shows how the boundaries were somewhat blurred. In its relationship to the Jewish people, the letters that we've just read speak of a growing consensus within the church that it's been given the inheritance that Israel has forfeited. The alienation that this implies between church and synagogue becomes yet more painful when one observes that the division was not just between Jewish believers and the Gentile church, but church versus the Jews. The prime example of this is Bishop Melito of Sardis, who lived from 120 to 185 CE. Melito was not only aware of his Jewish heritage, but knew enough of it to draw upon it. He would not have been alone in this, as quite a few of the leaders among the Asian Christians were of Jewish descent. He was a Quartodeciman, or a 14er, you could say, celebrating Easter on the 14th of Nisan along with the Jews, as did other bishops in Asia. Thus, and interestingly, as we're now approaching Passover, he wrote a form of Haggadah, a Eucharistic liturgy called Peri-Pascha. What's striking, especially knowing that he is Jewish, is its anti-Jewish polemic. Perhaps there's a personal element to this. Alistair Stewart writes, we have already seen that Melito's embrace of Christ alienated him from his Jewish family. Melito, as Jew, had cut himself off from his family as a result of his embrace of Christianity and stands as an exemplar on those whose alienation from his own race is complete. It could be that his reaction, his words against the Jewish people have a personal motivation. But his anti-Israelism comes to the fore, and it's unfortunate to say the least. Regarding the sacrifice of Messiah, he says, "What strange injustice have you done, O Israel? You have dishonored the one who honored you. You have disgraced the one who glorified you. You have denied the one who owned you. You have ignored the one who made you known. You have murdered the one who gave you life." And the key word there that causes problems is the word murdered. O Israel, what have you done? He says. Is it not written for you, you shall not spill innocent blood, so that you might not die the death of the wicked? And then he has Israel say, I, said Israel, I killed the Lord. Why? Because he had to die. And he accuses Israel and says, you have erred, O Israel, to reason so about the slaughter of the Lord. It is not only here, but at numerous points in this Haggadah that the charge of murder is leveled against Israel. All this in a city where Melito's Christian community was probably outnumbered by Jews. There's a very large synagogue that was discovered in Sardis. There's no doubt that Melito intended his words to be convicting and likely motivating to his Christian audience, but their harshness reflected a viewpoint that would resonate throughout history and be used as a rallying cry to this day of those who hate the Jews, that the Jews killed Christ. That said, if one can set it aside, it can hardly be viewed as helpful in the relationship between the Jewish people and the church in his own day. For this, Melito has been called the first poet of deicide, a dubious distinction. And so this brings us to a point, I think, where we should stop for now. We're coming up to our lunchtime, but we've looked at various writers, the last one being a Jewish writer in this period, who are showing an increasingly harsh supersessionist and you could say punishing type of supersessionism, punitive supersessionism against the Jewish people, and proclaiming the glories of the Gentile church. We are beginning to see more and more this alienation that is beginning to occur, but in the midst of it, the very strong connections that also still exist, as we saw in Ignatius's and Clement's writings and so forth. So these first 3 centuries are centuries of division, but also centuries that show how hard it was for the leadership of these early churches to separate their flock from the Jewish people. Thank you.